From the ancient book of Welsh mythology, the Mabinogion, comes the unusual name Dylan, which appropriately was given to a 20th century bard who wrote in English and is generally considered Wales' greatest poet, Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea in South Wales in 1914 and wrote much of his finest poetry at an early age. He also wrote prose and short stories, and one of his best-loved works is based on his own childhood in Swansea, in which he captures the humour and the colourful speech of the Welsh. A Child's Christmas in Wales. Here is his only daughter, Aeronwy Thomas, reading this charming, light-hearted story for us.
It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden, waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December, in my memory, is white as Lapland, though there were no reindeers. But there were cats. Patient, cold and callous, our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars, and terrible whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slink and sidle over the white back garden walls, and the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasin trappers from Hudson's Bay off Eversley Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. Or if we heard it at all, it was, to us, like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbour's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong, and we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms towards the house, and smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombilating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house, laden with snowballs, and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving a slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said, and we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero, and ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet and smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, would you like something to read?
But the lasting reputation of Dylan Thomas, whom some critics call the finest lyric poet of his age, rests on his serious verse. And it is his poetry which has won him a place in the famed Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, where a memorial plaque will be unveiled next to the grave of Lord Byron in 1982, on the 1st of March, the day dedicated to St. David, patron saint of Wales. Here Dylan Thomas will be immortalised, just 27 years after his untimely death.
And death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one with the man in the wind and the west moon. When their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not. And death shall have no dominion. And death shall have no dominion. Under the windings of the sea, they lying long shall not die windily, twisting on racks when sinews give way, strapped to a wheel, yet they shall not break. Faith in their hands shall snap in two, and the unicorn evils run them through. Split all ends up, they shan't crack. And death shall have no dominion. And death shall have no dominion. No more may gulls cry at their ears, or waves break loud on the sea shores. Where blew a flower, may a flower no more lift its head to the blows of the rain. Though they be mad and dead as nails, heads of the characters hammer through daisies, break in the sun till the sun breaks down. And death shall have no dominion.
Dylan Thomas is often quoted as saying of himself, 1. I am a Welshman. 2. I am a drunkard. 3. I am a lover of the human race, especially of women. This humorous and concise summary is full of truth, and it was number 2, the drunkard in Dylan Thomas, that brought about his death from alcoholic poisoning during a visit to New York only a month after his 39th birthday. Caitlin McNamara, who had left the famous Welsh portrait painter Augustus John to marry Thomas, also suffered from what is commonly called a drinking problem. And it is said that Dylan and Caitlin spent more of their married lives in local pubs than at home. Their daughter Aeronwy fills in some of the background to her parents' alcoholism.
Pamela Hansford Johnson was his first girlfriend, and he smartly went off her when she started telling him not to drink. My mother was Irish. I find that the Irish drink more than the Welsh. And my mother came from a heavy drinking family of her own. Her father died of drink. They lived in County Clare. The McNamaras, that's my mother's side of the family, owned a large estate there. And the large house they lived in had a wonderful cellar. And apparently my mother and her father started a hotel. It wasn't a success because both my mother and her father drank the contents of the cellar, thereby drinking the profits. My father died when I was only 10, and then when he died, my mother left for Italy, and I went with her. She'd been with my father to Elba, had wonderful holidays there, and they both liked it there. So I think in some ways she knew that place and she wanted to get back to something that perhaps that she felt was completely un-English. She wanted to get away from her usual set of drinking cronies because she felt that she was going to drink herself to death. And Italians don't encourage you to drink. There isn't this sort of way of life at all. And my mother's lived there for the last 27 years in Italy. It's been sort of self-imposed exile, if you like. She's following one of those Alcoholics Anonymous programs. She hasn't drunk anything for 10 years. I think she will find it very difficult to come across. She's meant to be unveiling the plaque at the actual ceremony, the installation of the plaque in Westminster Abbey, but she's going to find it difficult. She finds anything upsetting. It makes it more difficult for her not to drink.
The well-known English poet and novelist Kingsley spent 12 years in Wales as a lecturer in English literature at the university in Swansea, during which time he wrote his famous best-selling novel Lucky Jim. Tom Boyd asked him his opinions about the Welsh.
I think that most of the best people from Wales have been taken over willingly by English culture.
Dylan Thomas, I believe, never did know any Welsh, did he?
No, no. It's often said ignorantly that he did, but not a word, as far as I know.
While you were at Swansea, did you ever meet Dylan Thomas?
I ran into him once. I'll never forget that evening. It was in 1951 when I was well settled there, and Thomas, I think, didn't in those days come very often to Swansea. He was either in London or places beyond London, or the other side of Swansea in Larne, in Pembrokeshire. But on this occasion he was asked to read his poems at the Students' Union in our university, and it was fixed up for me and some other curious people and sympathetic people to turn up to have a drink with him before and after this reading. And I must say straight away that he was a disappointing man to meet, I thought. Not much to say for himself, and would not, in a sense, talk to us. He talked to the friend of his who was with him, and rather kept us at a distance. And I resented that at the time, but I've come to see later that I shouldn't have done, because a crowd of students and young lecturers like myself, not a crowd, half a dozen, 7 or 8 people, none of whom he knew, all of them looking at him and expecting him to say something marvellous. Now, you'd have to be a pretty tough, hard-shelled sort of character not to feel a little shy, to feel a little nervous. And I think that's what it was. I think that he, despite his rollicking exterior, I think there was something rather tender and shrinking inside him. But the reading was a great success, and I was very happy there, and it was a productive time for me. I enjoyed my job, I enjoyed my colleagues, and that very fine town, Swansea.
When Dylan Thomas died in New York, he had just finished writing one of his most popular pieces, Under Milk Wood. Here are some extracts from this rich comic slice of Welsh life in a village by the sea.
In the blind-drawn dark dining room of schoolhouse, dusty and echoing as a dining room in a vault, Mr. and Mrs. Pugh are silent over cold grey cottage pie. Mr. Pugh reads as he forks the shroud meat in from Lives of the Great Poisoners. He has bound a plain brown paper cover on the book. Slyly, between slow mouthfuls, he side-spies up at Mrs. Pugh, poisons her with his eye, then goes on reading. He underlines certain passages and smiles in secret.
Persons with manners do not read at table,
Says Mrs. Pugh. She swallows a digestive tablet as big as a horse pill, washing it down with clouded pea soup water.
Some persons were brought up in pigsties.
Pigs don't read at table, dear.
Bitterly she flicks dust from the broken cruet. It settles on the pie in a thin gnat rain.
Pigs can't read, my dear.
I know one who can.
Alone in the hissing laboratory of his wishes, Mr. Pugh minces among bad vats and Jeroboams, tiptoes through spinneys of murdering herbs, agony dancing in his crucibles, and mixes especially for Mrs. Pugh, a venomous porridge unknown to toxicologists, which will scald and viper through her until her ears fall off like figs, her toes grow big and black as balloons, and steam comes screaming out of her navel.
You know best, dear,
says Mr. Pugh, and quick as a flash he ducks her in rat soup.
What's that book by your trough, Mr. Pugh?
It's a theological work, my dear. Lives of the great saints.
Mrs. Pugh smiles. An icicle forms in the cold air of the dining vault.
I saw you talking to a saint this morning. Saint Polygata. She was martyred again last night. Mrs. Organ Morgan saw her with Mr. Waldo.
And when they saw me, they pretended they were looking for nests,
said Mrs. Organ Morgan to her husband, with her mouth full of fishes or pelicans.
But you don't go nesting in long combinations, I said to myself, like Mr. Waldo was wearing, and your dress nearly over your head like Polygata's. Oh, they didn't fool me.
One big bird gulp and the flounder's gone. She licks her lips and goes stabbing again.
And when you think of all those babies she's got, then all I can say is she'd better give up bird nesting. That's all I can say. It isn't the right kind of hobby at all for a woman that can't say no even to midgets. Remember Bud's bit? He wasn't any bigger than a baby, and he gave her 2. But they're 2 nice boys, I will say that, Fred Spit and Arthur. Sometimes I like Fred best, and sometimes I like Arthur. Who do you like best, Organ?
Oh, Bach without any doubt. Bach every time for me.
Organ, Morgan, you haven't been listening to a word I said. It's organ, organ all the time with you.
And she bursts into tears, and in the middle of her salty howling, nimbly spears a small flatfish, and pelicans it whole.
And then Palestrina,
says Organ Morgan.
Fern Hill, the farm near Llangain, where my father used to visit his Aunt Annie Jones for holidays, inspired him to write a poem which is more of a song than a poem. The poem Fern Hill is a cry about lost innocence. I think it is fair to say that my father never wished to grow up, like many of us, and lose the magic of his first vision of this world, which is perhaps the truest one. The last 2 lines of Fern Hill are chosen as my father's epitaph. They are inscribed on the plaque to be installed at Westminster Abbey. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. you.